lunchtime lecture series of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I'm Professor Gottlieb. I'm the chair of the center, and I'm especially delighted to be here today to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Mahmood Monshipouri. So technically speaking, Mahmood is a faculty member at San Francisco State University, but we consider him one of our own here at UC Berkeley because he does so much heavy lifting for the center, for the Department of Political Science, for the undergraduate major in Middle Eastern Studies. He teaches here regularly in addition to his appointment at San Francisco State. For those of you who come to our Friday salons, and I encourage that you do come because it's a wonderful experience, Mahmood is a regular there, and even though it's a forum that's especially designed for the non-specialist, we're always happy that Mahmood is there because when people start making up names and dates and facts, we have to bring things back.
I'm the student of that.
Well, we're all students in that form, but we're happy that you're a regular there. In any event, Mahmood serves as the chair of the Department of International Relations at SF State, and he specializes in human rights, identity construction, and globalization in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. He's published and edited many books, including Democratic Uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, Youth, Technology, and Modernization, that was in 2013, Terrorism, Security, and Human Rights, Harnessing the Rule of Law, in 2012, Human Rights in the Middle East, Frameworks, Goals, and Strategies, in 2011, Muslims in Global Politics, Identities, Interests, and Human Rights, in 2009, Islam and Human Rights Advocacy for Social Change in Local Context in 2006, as well as a co-edited volume, Constructing Human Rights in the Age of Globalization in 2003, and he's also editor of Inside the Islamic Republic, Social Change in Post-Khomeini Iran in 2016. Please forgive me if I missed any, and I'd like to know what you have for breakfast in order to achieve such levels of productivity. Mahmood received his PhD from the University of Georgia in 1987. He's taught at the University of Georgia, at Central Michigan University, Alma College, Quinnipiac University, Redlands University, and CSU San Marcos. During 2003 to 2006, he served as a visiting fellow at the Yale Center for International and Area Studies. The title of his lecture today is Social Change in Post-Khomeini Iran. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mahmood.
I'm honored to be here at the center. I've been a student at the center. I've learned a lot. Thanks to salon meetings, we have some leadership from that salon and some audience from salon. I cannot thank you enough for the opportunity to be at the center. Approximately 4 or 5 years ago, I was approached by Professor Mehran Kamrabah, who is the chair of the Georgetown University in Doha, Qatar, asked me if I can edit a volume on looking at not foreign policy of Iran, but looking inside of Iran and understand the demands and dynamics of the youth and changes, the socio-political changes. So I traveled 2 times to Doha. There were 2 rounds of scholars who came and contributed, and finally we actually put this book together by Oxford. A lot of things have happened that tells you something about the pace with which things are changing in the Middle East and the type of enterprise that we are involved in terms of not being in the business of predicting things because things will change. But be that as it may, I'm very happy to be here and share some of this, the content of this book with you. But I originally suggested that I talk about that. My talk was regarding the book. But today I'm going to actually break my presentation into the first half dealing with the inside the Islamic Republic, and the second half, I know a lot of folks here are interested in the recent eruption of political unrest in Iran. We're going to devote half of the time to that as well. Let me start out by saying that the focus of this book is the growing middle class in Iran and their demands and dynamics of the women, youth. We're going to look at the pop music, we look at the family, the way that family has transformed in the post-Khomeini era, and we're going to pay special attention to bunyads that are the major parastatal type of society, like a semi-state or non, governmental I don't know how to describe them, but they're very, very important institutions that are functioning sometimes to stifle free competition and free market and all those things we talk about it. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the Revolutionary Guards. I'm going to use the word Sepah. So anytime from here on you hear the word Sepah, I'm referring to Revolutionary Guards. I want to start out with some things that I learned by putting this book together and other things that came up after the publication of the book. I've become really a believer in the society of Iran. I've long argued that the Islamic Republic contains the seeds of its own transformation, and that is largely coming from within the society. Social change is slow, but transformation is happening at a very fundamental level. Much of this change points to generational gaps and generational changes that the young boys and girls in Iran are demanding. Green movement was led by many young, educated, and urban boys and girls. But if you look at the new eruption of this unrest, nearly 75 to 80% of them are below the age 30. So that's another wave of the young people making demands and dynamics on the system. But one of the things that I've learned in process of putting this book together and exploring what happened in recent unrest is that the state of the knowledge of the American people about Iran, and even diasporic community of Iranians outside Iran, I think the state of knowledge, to put it fairly, bluntly I should say, the state of knowledge is poor. They do not understand the complexities of the Iranian politics, and they have a tendency to oversimplify those things that are happening. Let me start with the middle class. Today in Iran, we have a middle class that is digitally interconnected, wired into the international network. They understand what's going on around the world. They have a very keen sense of what is going on, not only in the neighborhood, but globally. They clearly resist harsh socio-political condition imposed on them by a tiny minority of political elites who maintain tremendous influence and power over the rest of the population, and they are challenging them. They totally reject clerical, absolutist, and totalitarian rule, and we have reached the point where I think we need to ask ourselves, what should we expect? Are we going to see reform, revolution, or referendum? And I'm going to give you the fourth option, which is what I would call some kind of a strategic stalemate between the contending forces in Iran, which I would predict results into the Revolutionary Guards at some point really stepping in and taking over. So I'm going to talk about some of these opportunities and review them. First, I'm going to go back to the book. First chapter of the book was done by Professor Adib Muqaddam, who really talk about the dualistic nature of the Islamic Republic. On the one hand, you have a democratic system, you have free, fair elections. I don't know about free, but there are every 4 years, they are periodical. You do have periodical elections. On the other hand, you have a theocratic system in which at the top of this hierarchy sits a person by the name of supreme leader that has absolutist clerical power and overrules the elected members of the regime. So that's one of the irony of the system that has been working, but not really and soundly, and there are so much evidence. We don't need to actually refer to occasional anecdotes to find out what is going on. But what Adib Muqaddam did in the chapter said that there are a wide array of power blocks in addition to these two people. You do have guardian council, you have judiciary, and then you have Majlis parliament, and you have bunyads that are institutions that are on the receiving end of a lot of money. And so they are powerful, and they are the arm of the state. And last but not least, of course, we have Revolutionary Guards. I'm going to go a little bit fast on this slide because I have 40 of them. And because of the time constraints, I won't be able to kind of to proceed slowly. But if anybody wants the presentation, I'll be happy to make it available, plus the center has it, and you can get access to that. One of the key things in this book that is discussed by a number of authors in this book is that we're talking about a young demographics in Iran. 50% of the Iranians are below the age 30, which means that when the revolution happened, they were not in this world. And they had the foggiest idea what the revolution was about. And they constantly question their parents. That what was that revolution for? Look at our economic conditions. What did you guys achieve? And so there are, you have a young generation that is kind of detached from what happened and ideological precepts of the revolution. This young, the most interesting arguments in this book are coming by those who are focusing on young women that are making sort of a, they use fashion as a statement that they make. And one of the things they do, they typically, I don't know what should I do here. Okay. Everything sign that says okay. Okay, very good. You have a young generation of the girls who are actually questioning the imposition of hijab and dress code. And dress code and hijab are basically very intimately related to the ideological principles of the revolution. Growing number of these young girls typically tend to be city-dwelling Iranians. They started, pushing back against conservative traditions and social restrictions, and they would like to kind of follow Western style and modernity and all these things. There's a phenomenon that I didn't cover in this book, but I came to know that after the publication of the book. There's a phenomenon called white marriage, and the term white means like a blank piece of paper that, you haven't signed anything, you have no obligation. We have seen this phenomenon called white marriage, unmarried couples living together. This lifestyle, in a way, is a backlash to gender disparity. Younger generations now want to avoid contractual obligations because they're going through a lot of difficulties why they get themselves into a contractual obligations at the time that they are actually going through a lot of economic difficulties. Compared to the years past, these are data from 2016, marriages have declined by almost 7% and divorces have increased by almost 5%. So there are changes that are happening in society. I want to stick on this narrative of white marriage. You have the image here, which is a very fine image. Many Iranians today cohabit before marriage. It has basically economic reason, but it is also a way for them to live together and not being sort of bound by heavy weight of the marriage in terms of the handicaps that they face in all aspects of the life. Professor Mehrdad Davishpour, sociologist, Stockholm University, makes the argument that like any other society, the middle class in Iran is starting to prefer a lifestyle which is contrary to the traditional marriages and way of life. And he makes the argument that sex before marriage isn't taboo anymore. So you have a generation of Iranians that are actually thinking along those lines. But there are drawbacks to that. If you are in a white marriage and your partner is abusing you, where do you take your claim? If you take it to a court or something, you'll be in a violation. So there is a drawback to the white marriage because you get yourself into trouble. But the point that Professor Davishpour makes is that modernity cannot be stopped. Modernization is a different phenomenon because it has a lot of Western influence in it, but modernity is a universal thing. And what happens under the skin of the society, which is what happens in the private realm, is something that state cannot do anything about. So you have a generation of young people in Iran that are actually moving forward. They use the term obur kardan as, which means you bypass it. Bypass it. Laws, rules, cultural tradition, social restrictions, and you do what you want to do. And there's no way the government can really enforce the laws unless there is an abuse case in which one of the partners typically avoids reporting that because of the drawback that it has. One of the interesting chapters of the book, unfortunately I don't have the time to cover chapters by chapter. There's a wonderful chapter by Farzaneh Milani, who teaches at the University of Virginia. And she argues that politicians will come and go, elections, you know, are being held and governments are voted in and out. But the magical, the mystical, the ideational power of the words that women have expressed in manner of writing poses a real challenge. And those challenges are fundamental. The Iranian literary scene, she argues, serves as a barometer, as a metric for the post-revolutionary political landscape and theater which is in change. And she argues that art cannot be murdered and cannot be stopped. The emergence of women writers, she argues, and rightly so, they have become, the emergence of this has become a transformative socio-political force in post-revolutionary Iran. This is one of my favorite chapters in this book. And she mentions a book by Fariba Wafai entitled My Bird. This is a story of a wife that sees her husband is into migration. He wants to migrate. Eventually he migrates to Canada. She's left with the children, with an ailing mom. She has to take care of all these things. And she says to me, as a mother, I have done my obligations, and I am sort of tired of serving as a mother for the rest of my life. It's time for me to actually become a writer and express certain grief and sorrow that women will go through. Although the book is filled with grief and sorrow, but nevertheless, it's a very inspiring scene of courage and resistance to the traditional role of the mother and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting book to read. Another interesting chapter of the book is by Nahid Siamak, who's right now is a fellow, postdoc fellow at Yale. She had a piece in op-ed piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago, in which she talked about the bold challenges of Iranian women taking out their headscarves and making it a statement. She has a very interesting chapter. This book talks about pop music. It says a young generation in Iran, they want to really promote their own version of whatever music is, rap music, whatever it is. And they do not want to actually get into music which is government-inspired production. And during the Shah, she argues that during the Shah, the sadness of the lyrics of the music was a way of expressing opposition to the Shah by their own sort of local parlance and idioms. That was an idiom of opposition. But she says that during the post-revolutionary Islamic Republic, we are seeing more love songs. And those are another version or another idiom that are aimed at opposing the officially sanctioned type of music that promotes or thrives on culture or grief. In a way, we have seen the movement of music not from Los Angeles to Tehran, but rather from Tehran to Los Angeles. And the Ayatollahs in Iran are comfortable with that movement. The movement of music is from Tehran to Los Angeles, they feel like they're comfortable. At least our guys are not listening to the music composed by diaspora communities. And so I think the Islamic Republic is acting in a very pragmatic way. And this is exactly what Adib Mohaddam says in the first chapter, that the supreme leader, Vilayat al-Faqih, nowadays is not acting ideologically, but is acting very, very practical and very pragmatic manner. I think the Islamic Republic is trying to adjust itself to the changes in its society. Probably one of the best chapters of this book is by Professor Saleh Isfani on the family, and I strongly recommend this chapter. He talks about how a family has served as a major transformation, major vehicle of transformation. Here he talks about the narrowing gender gap in education, because now women are educated, men are educated, they are both source of income or revenue for the family, they have equal bargaining position. This is all good because Saleh Isfani argues that it will be a way for the family to invest more money in the direction of the kids because they can control the size of the family. So the average Iranian woman today, he argues, has 1/3 as many children as her mother and is more than 3 times as educated. So you have fewer kids and you are more educated. Urban women are on average more educated than urban men. 64%, 65% of university graduates are female. And in rural areas, there is some kind of equality between the genders as well. He goes on to say that equality in education, coupled with the lower burden in fertility, has improved women's power within the family, helping channel family resources towards the education of the kids, and women have a bigger say now in the size of the family because of their equal and equal bargaining position with their male counterpart. And now you're seeing 2 children per couple as becoming sort of a standard norm. One of the points that Saleh Esfahani ends up the chapter is that Islamic Republic now fears that the traditional family patterns has kind of spun out of control and it needs to be revised, it needs to be actually revived. So they are providing incentive for the 3rd, 4th child in the family. And they are, using the pretext that, as a hegemonic regional power, we need to maintain that we have a larger population, all these things. All of this is rejected by Professor Saleh Esfahani. It runs counter to the economic demographic theory, because that theory demonstrates that policies that increase fertility are anti-growth. The more population you have, the more you have to put money in welfare and feed them and all these things. Therefore, you don't have enough money to actually invest directly in economic growth. This, he argues, counterproductive to Iran's ambitions to sustain itself as a dominant regional power. So he questions that. Towards the end of the book, there's a chapter by Professor Monshipouri who teaches at TCU. He has a very interesting chapter. One of the reviews that I saw on this book was one of the reviewers saying that of all these chapters, he thought this was one of the best chapters in the book. And here, Professor Doraj looks at the para-stable foundation called Bunyad. Bunyad translates into foundation. That's a term, that's an Iranian term for foundation. But typically, it means religious foundation. Or there are foundations directed at the disenfranchised and the poor, and so they have a mission, like a welfare type of organization. Its mission is to help people who are poor, underprivileged, and destitute, and so on and so forth. But Professor Doraj says these institutions, or bunyads, are a quasi-governmental organization that are used as vehicle for arranging for aid, services, and handouts, sometimes cash handouts, to lower classes. What is their aim? Definitely, their aim is to recruit more people to incorporate into the security system, the CG system, and other systems that they have. And that way they can strengthen the apparatus of the government. So they are another arm of the state, but they are like hidden and they are on the radar and they're operating along those lines. As an instrument of power, they help to recruit for paramilitary elites and all these things. Professor Doraj goes on to argue that bunyads have monopolized the market, they stifle free competition, and they're not accountable to anyone, including the government. And they are tax exempt. They are less amicable to any way of, shape, form of privatization. They control an estimated 1/3 of Iranian economy. This is on page 258. This is really evidence-based argument. You have an organization that controls 1/3 of Iranian economy. How is that different from Supreme Council of Armed Forces in Egypt that controls close to 40% of the economy? I don't see any difference. One is called the SCAF, the other one is called Bunyad. These organizations have, over time, have been, transformed, morphed into political and profitable enterprises. That this is big business we're talking about. If you're controlling 1/3 of Iranian economy, we're talking about big business here. Let me conclude the book, and then I'll shift the theater to, of course, the recent eruption of the political unrest. I think what we have learned from Iran's Green Movement and the Arab Spring is that we have kind of lost sight of the fact that what is happening internally within the societies. And what the Arab Spring and the Iran's Green Movement and now the Iranian unrest have done is that to shift the spotlight back to internal, domestic political problems there. The Islamic Republic of Iran has found it very difficult to privilege strictly conservative Islamist value over the policy needs that people have. And so Islamic Republic has learned to be pragmatic, even as it aims at that for the purposes of political preservation. Socioeconomic and political developments have challenged the imposed Islamic vision of the state and society, which is not shared by the vast majority of the people. Let me shift the theater to recent unrest. What caused the recent outbreak of these protests? Will these protests fizzle out? Which in a way they have. But the question is that, were they the beginning of something new? I think so. To a lesser extent, I think they rocked the foundation of the regime. Some people say they were like a shot across the bow. I think they were more than that. We'll talk about that in the subsequent slides. What about Iran's internal political dynamics? I think recent protests intensified further Iran's internal political dynamics of this factionalism. What should we expect? I'll talk about all of these things in the coming slides. Let me start saying that what is the Iranian situation is and what led to the unrest. The core grievances for the unrest were economic discontent. Popular discontent primarily based on economic problems. Kind of reminds me of the Arab Spring in some ways. But I think I want to make the argument that it is beyond, when you go beyond the core grievances, maybe basic freedoms and other things are part of this core. Khomeini used to say the revolution that the Iranian had was not about the price of the watermelon. I'm afraid almost 4 decades after that, it has come to that. It's about the price of eggs. It's about the price of gas, fuel, rice, chicken. And people know nobody's talking about watermelon, but we are talking about the price of eggs. So 40 years after that revolution, we are seeing that the major problems of high prices and unemployment. Rouhani's presidency, in both terms, 2013 and 2017, was based on 3 things. I'm going to come to, when you voted me in the office, I'm going to take care of the nuclear deal, which I'm going to sign a nuclear deal. And number 2, I'm going to address the economic problems. And number 3, I'm going to loosen up social restrictions. We're going to give people more freedom. On all these accounts, not much success has been achieved. Problem areas, widespread corruption, which in Salon meetings we have had wonderful, thanks to the leadership of Salon meetings, we have had wonderful essays on why corruption is rife and endemic throughout the Middle East. Number 2, falling oil prices. They're checking out right now. I think they used to be 40, they're now $60. They're helping Iranian. The only thing that is actually helping Iranian economy is that the price of oil going up. I think one of the mistakes that Hassan Rouhani made was that he kind of oversold the nuclear deal. And when he oversold that to the Iranian, he lost expectation game. Because the assumption that nuclear deal will vastly improve Iranian economy proved widely off the mark. In large parts because we have in White House an American president who is either keen on decertifying the nuclear deal or throwing the ball into the European courts. And that has created a cloud of uncertainty around a lot of European banks and European companies who want to invest in Iran, but at the same time, they don't know whether they've been subject to punishment by the US laws and all these things, and they have a larger volume of trade with USA than with Iran, and they're not going to jeopardize that. Number 4, there is increasing resentment on the part of the Iranians about the adventurous foreign policy of Iran in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan. The Iranian military budget is, Iran's military budget is approximately $12 billion. They spend, these figures are rough figures, I don't have the exact figures. They spend roughly 5 to 6, I've seen as high as $8 billion on Syria. We're talking about annual spending in Syria. And they spend $1 billion on Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that brings the budget to close to less than $20 billion. And yet the president is talking about new liberal economic packages, which means subsidies will be cash handouts, which is $12 a month, will be cut or they will not be increased. So Iran's crisis is multidimensional. And you'll be seeing that in January 2018, you're seeing protests in front of Tehran University. Those of us who come from the region, we know this is in front of the entrance to Tehran University. And you have the female students who are holding a sign that says, college students are prepared to die, but we do not live in a dignified lifestyle. We are going to die for our dignity. That's what actually the sign says. Let me compare and contrast. Let me compare and contrast the 2009 Green Movement with the 2018. The recent unrest that we saw in Tehran by sort of disaffected, popular discontent and all these things, although it started from Mashhad by some radical Ayatollahs there, I'll talk about that in a minute, but nevertheless it kind of spread to more than 80 cities, small, remote, village areas, not in urban areas. Green Movement was an urban movement led by students, highly educated, middle classes. They had leaders. Everything was clear. They wanted to win an election, but these were kind of like spontaneous and street protests. They were not as large as the type of movement that we saw in Green Movement. Because in Green Movement, we saw one of the most massive, oppositions against the Islamic Republic. If you look at the recent unrest, started from a small places, but it has spread to big cities later on. But there was no clear objective, no leadership, no manifesto. There was nothing sort of a positive agenda of what the plan is. They didn't have a person in charge, a leader in charge. And in a way, some people said this was like a shot across the bow. But I think it was more than that. It was a rebellion that showed a number of things. The anger this time was a new anger. Some people call this a blue movement, which is the Bluecollar Movement. This was a new anger by the lower classes. And lower classes, by the way, were the ones that were a major supporter of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic invested in it. The Islamic Republic always claimed that the Islamic Republic is the protector of the oppressed, disenfranchised. And now the protesters from lower classes are challenging the very same ideology that brought Islamic power to the fore. And so the new anger this time was directed at the entire political establishment. What does it mean? The people said, we don't care about reformists, we don't care about hardliners, because reformists have made a lot of pledges have fallen on the wayside, and we have a situation where hardliners are blocking this and that, things are not moving, and that dichotomy between hardliners and reformers is no longer clear-cut in the minds of these people who unrest. What they're saying that, look, the blame should be placed on the entire political system. And so they came up with different sort of anti-establishment slogans. The economic grievances that they have, there are major economic grievances. In 2009, the problems were not necessarily economic. The problem had to do with, in 2009, Green Movement had to do with fraudulent elections. They manipulated the elections, and everybody came out and said, you know, where is my vote? How did my vote actually, why is it, I didn't count on anything. In 2009, only 1 million of Iranian people had a smartphone. Today, more than 48 million Iranian people have a smartphone. What does it mean? It means that the technology has created a situation where a state can no longer control the society. And things are kind of spinning out of control. Take the issue of hijab. The unrest gave women yet another fresh opportunity to air their frustrations over the hijab. So in December, a woman by the name of Vida Mowahed, see the picture here, reportedly stood on a utility box and the street called Istiqlal, which is a famous street. Stood there, and she took her headscarf and held it up on a stick and saying, you know, basically making the statement that we should get rid of hijab. And there's a video of that for less than 1 minute, and people actually passing by, looking at her, and some people sort of apathetic, some reacted, but she made a great statement, and this just went viral on internet. Rouhani actually has said this before and has repeated this after the unrest. Before the unrest, he has said the same thing. Rouhani came out and said that we cannot pick a lifestyle that is completely different from lifestyle of the 2 generations ago, and impose it on this young boys and girls, in this case, on young women. The views of the young generation about life and the world, their world vision is completely different from ours. He said to the Hardliners, look, heed people's demand before it's too late, because it is not just about harsh economic conditions that they're complaining. Hijab is not about economic condition. It is about the lack of political freedom. Rouhani went on to say, listen to the Hardliners. Let's listen to the Iranian people and enact commonsensical changes before it's too late. Before it's too late. It is not time to react militarily, but it is past time to react effectively on these things. Rouhani then released a 3-year-old report which was conducted in 2014, but was not published, was not released till after or in the vicinity of those unrest. And that report, which surveyed more than 1,000 Iranians, came up with the result that half of those who were surveyed said hijab should not be compulsory in mandatory. Question: why did he hold on to this report, which came out in 2014? Because the time was not right. When this unrest started, he felt like this is an opportune time to come up and release that. Let me talk about the core issue, the internal political struggles within Iran. I have never seen, in my lifetime of watching developments in Islamic Republic, such a divisive, fragmented elite that Iran is having right now. They are talking about a zero-sum game, and neither side, hardliners and reformers, are going to give up an inch because they consider that a zero-sum game. It's a loss. You have a situation where Rouhani has to move on with a plan of neoliberal modern economic changes in the system. And you have the other parties who are talking about resistance economy. What is meant by resistance economy? At the first glance, one thinks that resistance economy is that we have to resist imperial, colonial powers and all these things. No, resistance economy, get this one, it means that people should tolerate further economic pressure, should resist foreigners coming and investing. We should protect domestic enterprises. We should go against foreign direct investment, which is the major source of creating jobs in Iran. And so people should tolerate all kind of economic hardship in the name of resistance economy. So this is the two blocks, and Rouhani suddenly decided, either Rouhani or somebody within his administration, decided to leak the national budget. What does the national budget say? It says that we are going to increase the price of fuel, we are going to increase the price of basic commodities, we cannot afford to have subsidies and all these things. But I want to let you know that this portion of the money has been devoted to security entities. This portion of the budget has to go to religious schools, to bunyads, to mashad. It's ridiculous. If you look at the Iranian budget on environment, it is so notoriously low. But then you have $11–12 billion budget for the military establishment. Now the Iranian leadership would say, look, Saudi Arabia is spending $87 billion, we are spending $12 million. Add the contributions to Syria and Lebanon, we talk about $20 billion. But look, Saudi Arabia is a rich country, has 31 million, we have 80 million people in Iran, and you are spending money on religious foundations, bunyads, but you are not taking care of your people, you're cutting welfare state. So that's one of the problems, and Rouhani actually leaked that budget information to show that the money is actually being devoted unfairly to certain parts of the country, and we are going to add the price of this and that. And so, what was the result? Ayatollah Ahmad al-Huda, the Friday prayer leader in Mashhad, who is father-in-law of Raisi, who lost election, by the way, who lost election to Rouhani. Look at the connection between these two. In Mashhad, he goes on a Friday prayer and says, people, if you are unhappy with the economy, why don't you rebel, go to the street? That was the beginning of that. Why al-Huda is encouraging people to unrest? Because he knows that Hassan Rouhani has leaked the budget information, and he's saying that this amount of money should not be spent on bunyads, on the Sepah, on the Revolutionary Guard, all these things, because we have a lot of problems, welfare problems at hand. But then little did he know that this thing in Mashhad is going to spin totally out of control and become a popular revolt that is beyond control. And now there are actually the slogans of the protesters are against dictatorship and against the whole of Islamic Republic. But this dynamic is going on. There's also impending transition. Who's going to be the next supreme leader? I think Rouhani is kind of positioning himself to be the next leader, and Raisi wants to be the next supreme leader. If Iran is going to have a supreme leader institution after Khomeini dies. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So what should we expect? This is the final, it's sort of the most challenging question. Should we expect coup in Iran, subversion, destabilization, regime change? I think none of these opportunities are there, and there's no chance. Any regime change from outside is going to discredit the protesters who went to the street and had legitimate claim and actually were genuine and self-motivated, and they were not inspired or instigated from outside. This is going to distort people's struggle. Any attempt from outside, whether Saudis are spending money on some kind of international, network, information networks to instigate uprisings or whatever it is, or Americans are behind the regime change. I mean, Iranians have had a coup in 1953. We know that it's not going to work. If there is a coup in Iran, who's going to come to power? It's going to be Revolutionary Guards. They now call the shots, and effectively all matters related to external security being controlled by the Sepah. What is the point of having a coup? But I don't see that possibility at all. I do not foresee that possibility. So number two, revolution. Is Iran ready for another revolution? I don't know. When we talk about the revolution in Iran, you're sending shivers up and down on the spines of the Iranians. They have had one revolution in 1979, and they do not want to have another revolution. Revolutions are messy. They are totally unpredictable. They're not supported by middle class. Middle class in Iran is highly suspicious of rapid, radical, and unpredictable change. Because middle class of Iran looks at the Arab Spring. And they know that nothing has changed the state power after the Arab Spring. There's an interesting book that I shared with my students, a couple of my students, I see them here. There's a book by Crane Burton, 1938. The predictions of this book, believe it or not, this was a book about French Revolution, really stand to scrutiny today. And one of the things that, Brinton is an American historian of the French Revolution. And one of the predictions is that revolutions typically results into moderates coming to power. Then moderates cannot carry the day. Then moderates are going to be pushed off the scene. Then radicals will take over. And when the radicals take over, they cannot handle the situation. And the result is that they will get into what Brinton calls a Thermidor stage. When the fever of the revolution is totally break down. All the revolutionary personalities are withdrawn, revolutionary personalities are replaced. All the mantra of revolutions, ideas, ideological sort of the points that drove revolution, the people to the street and all these things, they will backtrack. And this trend is basically happening before our eyes today in Iran. Moderates came to power after the Islamic Revolution. They actually forced out of the power by radicals. Then Iranian political system moved from parliamentary system to presidential system. Now one term is by reformists, another term by right-wingers, and that goes on. And I'm not sure that, we all want change. I want to see change. I hear the hardships the people, the Iranian people are going, lack of freedoms and everything. And deep down in my heart, I want to change, but how the question, how do you achieve that change? By what mechanisms and method? That's where the disagreement is. Iran is politically polarized and is in a state of political deadlock. Look, do you want to know how Iranians are polarized politically? In the last elections, 24 million Iranians voted for Hassan Rouhani. 16 million voted for Raisi. 18 million people who were eligible to vote chose not to vote. We are talking about a country that is politically polarized and has reached a political dead end. Nobody has any clue among the clerical establishment what to do about this situation. And Iran is so divided that some of us sitting in diasporic communities in this part of the world and talking about revolution is the only solution, I think they're oversimplifying the complexity, the intellectual complexity of the Iranian political discourse there. Okay, they're done to reform. We want to talk about reform. The other option is referendum. And finally, we want to talk about the scenario about statement. The problem with the revolutions, we just talk about it. For any revolution to be successful, you have to have unity and common purpose. These are two important elements for revolution. Iran is not united, there's no common purposes. Middle classes did not participate in recent unrest for two reasons. A, it was not clear who started the revolution or uprisings, because it was manipulated by right-wingers, and it was not clear that what this uprisings are going to lead to. If they are leading to institutional breakdown, civil war, Syria, all these things, middle class, they share the popular discontent, but they fear for the security, so they kind of back down because of the Arab Spring experience. If you are going to have a revolution, you have to have class cooperation, you have to have social forces cooperation, political forces. If you have a diverse political social forces in the society, middle classes are singing this song, lower classes or working classes, industrial or rural working classes, they play by a different tune, you're not going to have the unity of purpose. And so this is not going to actually do it. The opposing groups, after the revolution, typically they fail to define exactly what is meant by the state. The ensuing factionalism and different aspirations and expectations, all things. The Iranian society, as we said, is very, very diverse. Reform. Reform in Iran faces deep structural constraints and problems. You have a system in which the elected powers do not have as much power as appointed power. So basically there are structural problems, and there are deep structural problems. Revolutionary Guards effectively calls all the shots on all matters related to internal and external security. This assumption that reforms are going to carry the day has proven to be way off the mark. Rouhani, I think, overplayed his hands on nuclear deal, and reformists have had enough time, but they've delivered the precious little offer to the people. Revolution is not working. Reform faces deep structural problems. What is the option? The other option. The option is referendum. Activists, lawyers, journalists, everybody in Iran, every intellectual party that I listen to and I read, they're talking about referendum. They say referendum is the third way. No revolution, no reform, referendum. Why the referendum is not a pure, it's sort of a cure-all to, panacea to all the problems, but I think it provides a democratic means for people to give a voice to the people. It's a very good idea. But for a referendum to be effective and to be a way out of this dilemma between reform and revolution, it should be held by unbiased authority, possibly UN, supervised by that. And it should be held long enough so that people exactly know what it is that they are voting on. Okay? That's an option. But referendum, I'm going to argue, is next to impossible if it means that you're going to have a referendum today that says, do you want to have Islamic Republic, yes or no? There will be no referendum, realistically speaking, on yes and no to the nature of the regime. Because, come to think of it, will the establishment acquiesce to its own political demise and destruction, given the fact that if you put a real election and referendum on, this would actually expose the frailty and the weakness of the regime. Which regime is going to actually accept this? Why would the regime agree to have a referendum, either symbolically or materially, when it means political suicide? The regime is not going to do that. So the people that are talking about referendum on yes and no, folks, it's a very good idea, but it's not going to happen. So let's not harp back on that. Let's talk about other things. Look, Iranian constitution, there's an article, Article 59. Hassan Rouhani is talking about this article. He says that, look at this article. Take a moment to read this article. It's a very good idea that if you get to a point of political stalemate, you should bypass the majlis of parliament and go to the people and put something to people's vote. Very good idea. But there's a conditions attached to that. When you look at the condition, it says 2/3 of the entire body of majlis should agree to that. This is not practical. Looking at the composition of the majlis, they're not going to actually, you cannot secure 2/3 majority. It's very difficult to do that. In addition to that, there is another article, which is Article 57. When you read this article, it says all this separation of power, judiciary, executive, majlis, and all these things. But at the end of the day, who rules is Velayat Amn, Velayat Faqih, supreme leader, is above this. So when Hassan Rouhani is talking about Article 58, Alam al-Huda, who actually instigated these uprisings to begin with, is talking about Article 57. These are the internal contradictions within the Iranian constitution. That's the complexity of the Iranian politics that I think those of us who are writing afar or commenting from a distance, sometimes we do not understand the subtleties and nuances of this complexity. Is there going to be a referendum on a different shape, in a different manner? I think there is a case to be made for that, although I'm not hopeful. If right now everything depends on Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he's sick, he's suffering from cancer and all these things, and he might die, I don't know, every minute, every month, every year, whatever. Everything right now depends on him. And things will not change as long as he is the Supreme Leader, as long as he is alive. If he passes away, we might have a shot at a different referendum. Not yes or no to Islamic Republic. We might have, perhaps, with a question mark, a big question mark, we might have a referendum that says, let's replace the Supreme Leader and create a council, a Supreme Council consisting of 3 to 5 people. This suggestion was made by Rafsanjani a long time ago. Why should we have one person in that position? Let's create a council. You know, how do you select the member of the council? I don't know. That's beyond me. I don't know. But I don't see the hardliners in the regime today agreeing to that. Why hardliners are they do not like the proposition of referendum. It's a scary thought for them. Scary proposition for them. Because hardliners would say, if you have a referendum on the Supreme Leader, tomorrow you're going to have a referendum on the climate change, you want to have a referendum on the water shortage, you want to have a referendum on this and that, suddenly you are into uncharted waters, and they're not going to risk their political life by saying, okay, let's have a referendum on something like this. And yeah, this is a very good time. I'm ending up on a scenario here, and then we can actually take up some questions. I stand before you very pessimistic about the political dynamics are changing in the world. And I say that with heavy heart, because I know that this could very well be the most realistic scenario facing us. And that's a scenario whereby elite, so divided, so fragmented, they play a zero-sum game. They cannot agree on anything. And Iran's future is going to be determined by factionalism, by camps who are putting their interests, the personal, individual, power-driven interests, over the national security, national interest of the nation of Iran. And we're going to see more striking back of this unrest that we saw. Disruptions, persistence, more active civil society, unrest. And it gets to the point where the country cannot agree on reform, there's no revolution, there's no referendum, nothing. You reach a state of stalemate, total strategic stalemate. I can guarantee you that Sepah is going to a stalemate. Revolutionary guards are likely to take over. And if they take over, this would be, I don't know, a soft coup or whatever coup, it would be a new situation where they will decide then whether they're going to have the possibility of another hardliner and populist leader such as Ahmadinejad, or they want to have another centrist such as Hassan Rouhani to be the next president. And this is where we are faced, this is where we are headed toward that option. Unless there would be a forging of a great coalition of opposing groups who will come together, and they will be so heavy in their camp that they will change the balance of power in their favor. I do not see that. Iran today is in a strategic state. But let me finish up this final thought. I think Islamic Republic contains the seeds of its own transformation, and it's largely coming from the society, because society is well ahead of the state. The state is stagnated in power struggle, whereas the society is moving with a wave of globalization. Islamic Republic can no longer posit itself as the protector of the oppressed and disenfranchised. Because these unrests show that they are coming from the parts of the segments of society that were 40 years ago among the major supporters of it. I used to say, iron fist may not be the solution to the Iranian problem. I don't know. If they're faced with this stalemate, and if poor people are seeing their economic situation progressively deteriorating, They may get to the point of say, we don't care about hardliners or reformists. Let's revolutionary guards, let them take over. Perhaps they can address the problems of the basic necessities of life for us. Perhaps we can actually survive under them. So, iron fist may or may not be the solution. I don't know. I put a question mark. And I don't know. I don't want to pontificate about the future. Social scientists should not be in the business of prediction. We should be in the business of trying to explain certain things here. Regime survival prevails over ideological loyalties. Ayatollah Khomeini said it 40 years ago. It's the case today. If it comes between the state and Islamism, the state prevails. If Sabah takes over, no major shift in Iran's foreign policy will happen. Even as many Iranians resent the fact that Tehran is spending more money in Syria than addressing the climate change and problems of the world. More money in Hezbollah than addressing the development problems. If Sabah comes to power, do not expect Iran's foreign policy to go through major drastic change. Thank you so much. You have a great argument.
We do have time for questions and answers.
Yes.
If you
Sure.
okay. The floor is open.
Yes.
First, a comment. I'm delighted you referred to the Anatomy of Revolution, a textbook, probably by far the oldest person in this room, which greatly influenced me as a student. How many? 65 years ago, or something like that. In which Brinton develops the figure of the man on the white horse, who I think is equivalent to the IRGC in your discourse, as the inevitable dictatorial figure who takes over after an extended post-revolutionary period of unrest. The question I wanted to ask was, given your analysis, your very cogent analysis, what should Washington be doing? An easy question. What should be U.S. policy in this situation?
Thank you so much for this wonderful question. I've thought about this question more than you probably 100 times about that. I think the best policy with regard to Iran would be a hands-off policy. Do not interfere. Do not put the stigma of regime change from outside. Do not discredit this voters' genuine unrest and legitimate demands that they have. Hands-off policy. Let the matters take their internal political dynamics and natural dynamics. The American intervention in Iran, Iranians, you have a young generation in Iran which is very pro-West. And they are openly pro-West. But you do have the older generation that are very, very worried of the U.S. intervention. And they have seen the implications, the grave implications of that in the 1953 coup. So I think let the Iranians actually decide their own destiny and let them have a fair share at unrest. And they are prepared to make sacrifices. And change cannot be peaceful at all times. But they are ready to pay the price of that because the economic hardship and lack of freedoms and everything else has really piled up so much that I think hands-off policy would be the best policy. Yes.
How do you think society in Iran would react if Iran allowed civil society organizations or provided ways for people to express their thoughts without police? How do you think it would affect?
Well, we do have. You're right. I mean, they had under Khatami for two periods, two-term presidents, 1997 through 2005. The civil society expanded under Khatami. It was very successful. And I made a lot of trips during that period. I held workshops, human rights workshops for university students during that period, 8-year period. But there are limits to what civil society can do if the levers of the power are controlled by Sabah, Revolutionary Guards, or you have a guardian council that consists of 12 people, 6 clerics that are appointed by supreme leader. The other 6 are appointed by judiciary, approved by the parliament. And the irony is that supreme leader appoints the head of the judiciary, Mahmood. And so you see that, and then this group of 12 will vet the candidates. you have to go through, you have to be filtered through the Guardian Council in order to be a nominee for the election. There are structural problems. Civil society is very good for associational life. Teachers, lawyers, journalists, they form their own association, and it's very thriving in Iran because you can't protest, but you invest in associational life. It's a very good thing because it creates networks of like-minded people that share the common goals. But at the end of the day, what really changes the political scene is that who controls the power. And associational life always comes to a wall which reveals its limits in terms of controlling the power and changing and creating drastic changes. Yes.
My question is based on an analogy to Germany after World War II,
Yes.
when the grandchildren were full of "what did you do in the war, Grandpa?" Is this going on in terms of what you do before the revolution, Grandpa?
Yes, absolutely. I think I touched upon that just in passing. You have a younger generation in Iran who is openly pro-West, or generally pro-US, they want to. And they do not share the views of their parents. And they have a different identity. When it comes to one of the chapters of this book, they didn't have the time to cover that, by Professor Mansour Muhaddad, is that you have a young generation today that in terms of identity, they are patriotic in terms of certain affinity they have with the nation, but they are very much in terms of identity, they're very secular and very nationalist, and they're very global in that sense. They are nationalists to some extent, but they are also globalized in their thinking. They do not share the ideological precepts of the Islamic Revolution. They don't understand it. They were not born with that. And they always blame their parents for, is this what you voted for? And what did you expect? And why did you change? And where have you been actually getting afterwards? So you have a new generation that is totally part and company with the old generation. And what Iran is faced with, and I think Hassan Rouhani really understands that, is this generational gap and generational conflicts that the regime is trying to kind of not showing any alarm to this, sounding alarms, not showing any reaction to this. But the younger generation of Iran knows that the Titanic vessel of the Islamic Republic has hit an iceberg of a new protest wave and may survive this one, but not the future one. And they know that, and they use the same analogy that I used here. Because they have watched a movie called Titanic. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by this idea of the white marriages. I wonder how, in practice, that can work, because it requires a collusion of your whole neighborhood. Certainly your neighbors in an apartment building will know if you're married or not, wouldn't they? Are people using, are they using this sort of Shiite temporary marriage idea to make it seem Islamically okay, or how are they getting away with this?
No, it's a very interesting question. I was curious about that, so I talked to one of my friends who teaches somewhere in Tehran, and he always asks me not to mention his name. He says that landlords today, they never ask you for a license of marriage. It's a very interesting thing, because they need, maybe you can offer them a little bit more money beyond the rent or something, and they don't ask. In the past, couples will go there, you have to show a license of marriage. Okay, and so there was this temporary marriage, and some people do that. It was religiously justified. It was a sort of a, I don't know, I don't want to use the word prostitution. What should I say? Legal. Yeah. I don't know, but nowadays you go and landlord says, two people, we want to live here. In fact, there is, I think, a congresswoman in Iran who went on internet and said, I've been living with this man that I'm not married to. What a courageous person to do that. And that was actually went viral. The congresswoman came out and said that. And this is very, I mean, completely different from the temporary marriage that is sort of a legalized. But I don't know, maybe some landlords, I don't know, maybe the driving force is economy or something. But it's very interesting, landlords never ask you, because they know that the law against landlords cannot be enforced. Unless there is a dispute between the couple or something that is reported, and how do you know that the couple that are living there are married or not? And landlord says, I don't care. Unless something happens, then he will be, of course, liable to some law or something. Julia, yes.
Yeah, a comment and a question.
Yes,
So my
please.
comment is that often when I hear scholars of Iran talk about Iran, they always say they're pessimistic. And as somebody who studies the rest of the region, I find extreme optimism in Iran because, I mean, we might not know what the immediate tomorrow looks like, but in terms of, structural variables, I mean, solid middle class, very high levels of education, a strong bureaucratic state, a strong civil society comparatively, some experience. So you have some indicators, anyways, just a comparative point of view that I see a lot of optimism in Iran. But my question is about the foreign policy. So you talked about the adventurism angle and how that may have played out in the protest, but just to play devil's advocate and to put aside normative considerations, but some would say that Iran's foreign policy has been very successful compared to, it is the regional power today, especially compared to perhaps Saudi Arabia's foreign policy. And so I'm curious how that plays out if the regime, what does the propaganda scene look like inside Iran? Are there people who actually believe there's a pride in Iran rising as a foreign power? Yeah, I'm curious how that plays out internally.
Very good. To your comment, yes, Iran has, to your point, Iran has every condition that is sort of ripe for transition to democratic sort of stage. And they have the population, they have civil society, that are very, wired up, globalized, and all these things. But you have a society, and then you have a state, and the state basically, at the end of the day, they run the system. And they let the youth have social freedoms and all these things, but they know that as long as they do not actually step into their political spheres, they're safe. And maybe that's one of the reasons that I'm pessimistic is that since reformists came to power, say, if not Rafsanjani with Fatah, 1997, they have been in power for a long time, with, of course, the period, interlude, the period of Mahmoud, but they have not delivered. I don't know how many years you have to actually give them to deliver precious little, something. They haven't. So we are kind of. Not that I'm giving up on reforms. I'm thinking that they have had the chances and they haven't delivered. To your question, Iranian foreign policy has been successful in the region in protecting, making sure Bashar al-Assad stays in the office, make sure that Hezbollah is supported, and through Syria they can control the movements in Lebanon, and occasionally looking at Hamas and trying to say, well, we are supporting them and all this things. At what cost? Enormous cost. Enormous cost for the domestic needs of the Iranian. There's an old saying in Iran. If you have a candle, the first thing you have to do, you should use it to lighten up your house, not to go to mosque. You have to invest in candle in your house, and then mosque. There's the Mustafa Taiza, the reformist, I want to quote him on something that he said. He said, Napoleon went to a major war, and achieved a major victory. About 70% of his troops were destroyed. And he turned around and said to his people, another victory like this would be functionally equivalent to our destruction. Foreign policy victory for Iran has been achieved at a great cost. At a great cost for people who live in Iran, and 30 million of Iranians, low-income Iranians, are dependent on $12 cash handout subsidy on a monthly basis. And you know what? It makes an awful lot of difference in their life to get that $12. That is how pathetic the situation is. But Iran foreign policy, $6 billion in Syria, $1 billion on Hezbollah in Lebanon, adventures in Afghanistan, adventures in Iraq, control this and that. Yes, at the end of the day, Shiites are minority. At the end of the day, Shiites should not play sectarian card because they are faced with 85% of the Muslims being Sunni. This is a losing card. This is not even a trump card to play. Iranian foreign policy, you're absolutely right, has been successful in basically maintaining its influence in the region. And a lot of people give Iranian foreign policy tremendous credit, but it has been a costly adventure for Iran. And local people today in Iran, I cannot feel their pain because I live on this side of it. But tremendous resentment toward the fact that why should we pay for a dictator called Bashar Assad to survive in Syria? Why should we pay the cost of it? And increasingly among reformists, journalists, Iranian activists, this question is raised that is Syria better off with Bashar Assad or without him? And if it is, why should we are getting credit for that? And you know what the regime rationale is? That if we could not contain the development in Syria, ISIS is going to knock at the door and come to Iran. This is like playing the fear card. Iran doesn't share a border with Syria. Iran shares a border with Iraq. And so to play this fear card that ISIS, Daesh, is going to come into Iran, this is like playing on the fear card, and this is another rationalization for the regime to justify $6-7 billion money here, $1 billion here, and then announce in the budget that Revolutionary Guard and Bunyad and these religious institutions are going to earmark tremendous amount of budget for them, and next year be prepared for the price of egg, fuel, gas, everything going up. Iranian people, tremendous, vast majority of Iranian people resent this type of foreign policy. But they don't have much voice because we know who is running the system. That's where the Iranian situation is. That's where the political foreign policy of Iran makes me feel like that we're not going to see a lot of change if IRGC comes to power. Don't expect any foreign policy change. So I don't know, and so that's my response to honest response to your first question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm wondering how concerned are the Iranian people with the fact that the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, some of the Gulf countries would like to see regime change. And given the U.S. track record, for example, are perfectly capable of creating an incident or whatever, and especially with the president we have, but in any case, regardless. And if there's a great deal of concern about that, how does that play into the domestic politics in terms of dealing with your own domestic problems when there's this pall possibly hanging over the entire nation?
It's a very good question. It's a very critical question. And I think the Islamic Republic plays on this card very, very shrewdly. And realistically speaking, Iran is, in the region, is strategically isolated. It has one of its neighbors to be a member of NATO, Turkey. Has had war with Iraq 8-9 years. The neighbors to the east of it, one of them is nuclear equipped. The neighbor to the north, Russia, is nuclear equipped. In the south, there's GCC countries, Gulf Cooperation Council. There's 6 Arab countries of the Persian Gulf region. That, with the exception of 1 or 2 of them, Qatar and Oman, the other 4, they do not seem to be in friendly terms with Iran. I don't want to use the term strategically loneliness because Iran actually deals with other countries, with India, China. It's not that lonely, but it's strategically isolated. And the fact that the Iranians are ethnically diverse, you have Arabs in the south, Azeris in the north, Baluchis to the east, and Kurds to the west. This creates a situation that holding on to the center is very, very critical. And in order to have the stability and order in Iran, you have to have a strong government. You have to have a very strong government. You know, if in the United States there is no agreement between the parties and the government shuts down, you still have a state. But if a state falls out in Iran because of the tensions within the regimes, between the camps, this is harbinger of bad news. The Iranians know that they are isolated. And so that is the sense of nationalism among the Iranians very high. Runs at fever pitch, in large part because of this sense of strategic isolation. And that's why they're looking for allies like Syria among the Arab world and all these things. And the regime very shrewdly plays that card. And you know what? It's very effective. Because it deeply resonates with the Iranians who feel they are isolated strategically. And they are very, very shrewd in using that, and it works. So you're absolutely right. There's this thing that can be capitalized and exploited. But there, yes.
But I also meant it in terms of it being a real fear, in terms of what a U.S. agenda might be in Saudi Arabia.
The fear is there, yes, absolutely. There's a real fear. And that message is conveyed to Iranian people, and most Iranian people share that view. Yes, yes.
Yes, you mentioned that Rouhani may be positioning himself as Iran's next supreme leader. And I'm wondering, first of all, what you think the likelihood of that scenario is, given the significant pushback that he would face. But I also wonder, if he were to be elevated to that position, whether he would be able to emerge as this sort of, almost like a Gorbachev-like figure, which is how a lot of people think of him, or whether he would be constrained by other institutions, or whether he's even committed to the kinds of reforms that liberal-minded Iranians want in the first place at all.
Yeah. Well, we have had these questions a long time ago. When Khatami came to power, you know what the biggest question was? Is he Khrushchev or is Gorbachev? We have had these questions, and I can't tell you definitely what the answer to that is. But that's what I said in the course of my presentation. There would be a struggle as to who would be the next supreme leader. And I qualified my statement by saying that if that institution of the supreme leader survives, which I don't know, that's an iffy thing. If Sepah agrees to have a supreme leader, not the council, then there would be a power struggle. And say Hassan Rouhani wins that power struggle. This is a good news for Iran because Hassan Rouhani is a centrist, probably does not want to maintain a lot of powers over the presidency and all these things. But all of this comes down to Sepah. The question that is the biggest question, and to which nobody has the answer, is that is Sepah, Revolutionary Guard, are they united or they are divided among themselves? And which direction they want to take the country to? They want to take the country in the direction of another sort of, phase of a hard, line. Look, after this unrest, Supreme Leader came out and said, Sepah should, Revolutionary Guards, should act professionally. They should go back to the barracks. They should not interfere into economy. And they should not be part of the privatization. Why did they invest in privatization? You know what the reaction of the Sepah was? They said tacitly, yes, okay, we plan not to interfere into privatization, you're not part of the private economy, you're acting professional, we go to barracks. But then they turned around and they said, you know what? We cannot survive with the money that we are getting in Sepah. We need to invest in economy in order to maintain ourselves. And it was like Supreme Leader's message fell on the deaf ear. And basically Sepah does the same thing. They're heavily involved in privatization of economy. It all depends on what type of future scenario Sepah has in mind, because they are the one who will get Iran out of the stalemate, or they are the ones who will help linger in this tension. I don't know. That's a question that nobody has the answer to. The gentleman sitting back.
Yes. Can you explain a little more about why the nuclear deal has not resulted in any economic improvement? For example, have countries like Russia, China, and others who are not as concerned about the U.S. retaliation, are they investing? And if not, why not?
Well, a lot of European companies have had plans to invest in Iran by way of foreign direct investment. They are buying Iranian oil right now without any restrictions attached. And some of them are investing in Iran. But they are doing that hesitantly because if you look at the volume of trade between Iran and China, probably does not exceed $20 billion. But the volume of trade between China and USA exceeds $200 billion. And I don't know Chinese are going to jeopardize that if they are subject to some kind of American banking system restrictions. Many of the European banks, they are willing to invest in Iran, but they don't know whether the nuclear deal will be decertified or it will be thrown into their court, and the EU has to make a decision. There's a little bit of this cloud of uncertainty that has not, the nuclear deal hasn't had any major dividends for the Iranians. The banking system in Iran is collapsing. And as a result, the rial is collapsing. And the devaluation of the money is going at such a pace that is unbelievable, unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic. All of this, in Iran is getting to the point that people are putting deposits in the bank, but there are no guarantees for their deposits. Therefore, they decide not to put it in the bank. Maybe they can invest it somewhere else. I don't know, maybe they can buy an apartment in Dubai. So there is this cloud of uncertainty that Washington has put on any deal with Iran that has really complicated the Iranian economic situation getting better. But the problem with Rouhani was that Rouhani actually campaigned on that platform. I'm going to get the nuclear deal. Everything is going to be normalized. We are going to actually invite foreign direct investment. This would be the beginning of the decline of unemployment and all these things. But his pledges have fallen on the wayside, by the wayside. And so people are getting to a point where that dichotomy of hardliners, reformists becoming not clear cut for them, and I don't know, they're looking for third alternatives, and I don't know what the third alternative is. I just run by you some of these things. If Washington is going to change its direction, things must be, I think they will be better off. There's a debate among some circles of the Iranian intellectuals that they make this argument. The route to improvement to Washington goes through Israel. If Iranians can reconcile some of the differences in the region with Israel, they might be able to move one step closer to normalization of relationship with Washington. But as long as everything they say is anti-Israeli and anti-American, and you know what, those slogans do not sell among the Iranian intellectuals and the young, forget about young generations. I'm talking about Iranian intellectuals. They would say the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was not about anti-Americanism, anti-Israelism. It was about independence, dignity, and the establishment of a system called the Islamic Republic. 40 years after that, they say they're making the same argument that the Iranian Revolution, who said the Iranian Revolution is based on one pillar, which is anti-American, anti-Israeli thing. They call it American, Israeli, anti-American, anti-Israelis. These were not the major principles of revolution. And so this is an intellectual argument which is actually winning public opinion. And you have a young generation who really doesn't care about this type of anti-American, anti-Israeli foreign policy, and they're onto a different business. And so this is where we are.
I'm afraid we are out of time, so I want to thank you so
My
much for
pleasure.
your
Thank you so much.
generous